Let's see where.
I'm gonna
Oh,
just I'm gonna interrupt for just a minute. I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Colleen Hitchcock, and I just want to welcome everybody while we're letting some more people come in from
okay.
the the waiting room. I think I've gotten everybody in. As you've come in from the waiting room, you'll note that you are muted. So we are in a regular Zoom meeting. So we're just going to ask that the participants in the Zoom meeting just stay muted until there'll be time for questions at the end. If you think you might not remember your question to the end, you can also dump it into the chat and I will read those out loud at the end as well. Um, Right. People are still entering the waiting room, so we'll just give it another minute. I think we're pretty good. Okay. I also want to just note for the record that we are recording this event. So we will be recording. It is not recording people whose video is not on. So just keep that in mind. And I will stop the recording at the end of the presentation from Dr. Primack to allow people to have more of a conversation that we will not necessarily post to the cloud. So again, I'm Colleen Hitchcock. I am here on behalf of the Swampscott Conservancy and just want to welcome everybody to our event. One day we will eventually hopefully get back to some in-person events, but I am excited to see how many people have joined us here today. For the record, we are at 78 participants for our event today, and so I would love to be able to get together with that many people in real life for sure. If you're having trouble, somebody's asking me if I can speak a little bit louder. I'm going to get a little bit closer to my computer, but if you're having trouble hearing me, maybe try adjust some of the settings on your computer as well. I will definitely lean in to make sure that you are able to hear me. And I'm just going to, yeah, just checking my microphone settings. So I think I should be good to go. All right, so again, on behalf of the Swampscott Conservancy, welcome to this event. If you have not heard of the Conservancy before, just wanted to introduce you to some of the things that we are all about here in the Conservancy. And so the Swampscott Conservancy is a nonprofit here in the town of Swampscott. We kind of take a four-pronged approach to our work in town, and that is an education approach, which you guys are participating with us here today. So we host events. They're typically in person, but we are, again, excited to have everybody here online with us. We do a lot of community building, so you can see some images down there on the right. We've gone birding together. We are out at the farmer's market when the farmer's market occurs, so stop by and say hi to us once we do get back out in town. And we've been working on some habitat restoration and improvement projects, from the pollinator garden down at Town Hall to the small meadow restoration project at the middle school. And then finally, a topic that's near and dear to my heart is citizen science and community engagement in the scientific process. And so, as many of you know, we have an iNaturalist project in town. And so if you want to learn more about that, feel free to reach out or check out our website to learn more. There's lots of ways to get involved with the Conservancy. You can become a member. You can join our monthly meetings. They are open to all. You can participate in our education events. You can do citizen science with us. And of course, you can volunteer. We will always take some helping hands out in the field to make Swampscott a better place. Okay. Whoops, sorry. And so with that, what I'd also like to do is, if you haven't found us, to go ahead and find us on the web. You can also email us. And at this point, I want to again welcome you here for Walden Warming. I do want to take a minute to just recognize our co-sponsors in this event. Salem Sound Coast Watch is our partner organization up in Salem, and for over 30 years they have been working as an environmental nonprofit, making our coastal waters and marine habitats clean and safe while inspiring the next generation of enthusiasts. They have been leading the way for a healthier sea and shore, and they welcome all to join them in our rivers, salt marshes, dunes, beaches, and estuaries. With increasing sea level rise and more intense storms, Salem Sound Coast Watch is committed to helping communities adapt and improve resiliency. They have a ton of ongoing events. They also do a lot of citizen science, so please get involved with the Conservancy. And upcoming on February 24th at 7 p.m., they'll be hosting Dr. Lindley Hansen, who's Professor Emerita of Geology at Salem State University, who will explain the geological history and evolution of the Salem Sound. And you can find the link to that talk on their website, which is simply salemsound.org. And when I'm done chatting, I'll try and drop that into the chat for people. I also want to thank the Swampscott Library for co-sponsoring this event and helping us to get the word out tonight. And so please support your local library regardless of where you are. We know that the Swampscott Library for us here in Swampscott is definitely a treasure. And now finally, I'd also like to recognize the Unitarian Universal Church of Greater Lynn, who is also a co-sponsor of this presentation, and specifically the Green Sanctuary team, and thank them for all of their efforts in getting the word out. An important principle of the UU Church is respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are part. In furtherance of this principle, the Green Sanctuary team is committed to building awareness of environmental issues, including presentations such as the one tonight. And with that, I also would like to introduce Reverend Vicki Weinstein, who would like to say a few things about the UU before we introduce Dr. Primack tonight.
Hey, thank you, Colleen. That was a lot. I just want to welcome you all and say that we really wish we could have, hosted you in our beautiful sanctuary in our beautiful building on this snowy night. But things being as they are, that isn't possible. So we're very grateful for the technology that allows us to be part of this with all of these wonderful community partners. I just wanted to say, if you're at the church property, a lot of people have been walking there or walking their dog and getting in touch with your emotions and spiritual needs right now at this really rough time. If you see a car in the parking lot and you see the license plate Walden, that's my car. So Thoreau is and this work is very, very important to me. I used to be a high school English teacher, so there was the literary connection, and then I became a Unitarian Universalist minister, so there was the Transcendentalist connection. The Transcendentalists were also Unitarians, and so that just to say that there are so many ways to come to this work, Walden, and so many ways to love it and to care about it: literary, spiritual, environmentalist. So again, I want to welcome you however you're coming to this, and for whatever reasons. You can learn more about our congregation at uucgl.org. And I'm excited to hear Richard's presentation. So Dr. Primack, I think you're next, but I'm not sure.
Well, I'm gonna do one more thing to just introduce
great.
Richard to our group here. But thank you for that kind of connection and really kind of setting the stage for how these groups have come together. So with that, I will introduce Dr. Primack. He is here tonight to present Walden Warming. Dr. Primack is a professor of biology at Boston University with a specialization in plant ecology, conservation biology, tropical rainforest ecology, and climate change biology. He's the author of 3 widely used conservation biology textbooks. And if any Brandeis students are on here, you know we've used the Primack text in class. So here is that infamous Primack that I refer to all of the time in class. The local co-authors on his books have helped to create 36 translations of the books and also to contextualize those textbooks with local examples. For 9 years, he served as editor-in-chief of the journal Biological Conservation and served as the president for the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation. His research has appeared in places such as the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the National Geographic, and other publications, and he's often interviewed on NPR. And so if that doesn't bring fandom, I don't know what does. And then finally, Primack often gives talks and writes for the general public on issues on these topics such as climate change and ecology. And so we're really excited to have him here tonight with us. And one more just logistic issue, I do want to thank the Brandeis Environmental Studies Program for their in-kind support in hosting this event via Zoom tonight. And with that, I will hand it over to Richard and stop sharing.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for this introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've heard the name Swampscott my whole life, and it's finally great to be there in person. I think the last time I was in Swampscott was probably about 60 years ago when I visited my grandparents who used to spend their summers in Swampscott. So it's great to be back again. It's also great to see Colleen Hitchcock. And as later in my talk, if you keep your ears open, you will see some references to the work that she and I have done together. So it's something to kind of foreshadowing something later in my talk. Okay, so maybe it's time to begin. Let's see if that will work. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now? Okay, it's in the screen sharing mode and all that? And I'm not muted? No, okay, great. How many professors have given lectures completely muted and not realized it until the end? Anyway, so I'm going to talk to you this evening about the research that I've been doing with my students and colleagues for the last 20 years. And this is really collective work done by many people. So if I use the first person singular I mean, it's again done by a lot of different people. I'm including Colleen Hitchcock, who's here tonight. So this work began in 2003 when I was working on the latest edition of my textbook, Essentials of Conservation Biology. And I realized as I was working on the textbook that all the examples in my textbook of conservation biology, which was supposed to be kind of a universal textbook, all the examples of climate change were from faraway places in the world. So for example, polar bears in the Arctic or wildflowers in the Swiss Alps. And I wondered why we don't have examples of climate change from anywhere in the Eastern United States or anywhere in New England. And so in 2003, I decided to completely change the research that I was doing. Instead of working on tropical ecology, work on the island of Borneo in Malaysia, I decided that I would start working with my students to try to see if we could find evidence for the effects of climate change here in New England. And so my presentation today is just a summary of what we've been learning about over the last 17 years. So it turns out that if you're going to look for the effects of climate change, you couldn't find a better place than New England. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one reason is that New England actually has better weather records than any other place in the United States. So in New England, we have the Blue Hills Observatory, which is the oldest continuously running weather station in the United States. And at this weather station, and you can see some of the records right here, that from the 1830s to the present time, that in the Boston area, we've warmed by about 2 degrees centigrade, or that's about 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 170 years. And that's actually about twice as much as the rest of the United States. For reasons that people still don't understand, the New England region has actually warmed more than the rest of the United States. And so this is actually good for climate change research because we've had a lot of warming here. So we've had as much warming already in New England as the rest of the United States will get by the end of this century. So great place for that reason. And so throughout this lecture, I'm talking about climate change, and mostly in New England, we're talking about a warming climate. And we also have other aspects of climate which are changing. So for example, the rainfall is changing. So actually New England is getting more rainy. Most of the United States is getting drier, but we're getting more rainy. Another aspect of global climate change is a rising sea level, which you should be very aware of in Swampscott if you're not already. And also carbon dioxide levels are rising, and carbon dioxide is an essential nutrient for plants. And so if CO2 levels are rising, it will have an impact on plant populations as well. And I think, as most of you know, that the reason that the climate is changing is because people are burning ever more fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas, and also because we're cutting down tropical rainforests and releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this is really creating a blanket because carbon dioxide traps heat close to the Earth's surface. And so when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then we're trapping more heat close to the surface and we're raising the temperatures. there's not really a debate among scientists about whether CO2 levels are rising or whether people are causing it. That's really very well understood. What there really should be more of a discussion is really about what are we going to do about it? How are we going to deal with the problems caused by these rising CO2 levels? So what are the impacts of these rising CO2? So in New England, sometimes we think, well, if it gets a little bit warmer, that's actually pretty good because then we'll have a milder winter and that'll be great. But actually, there's really terrible worldwide consequences of global warming. And you can see that in this map here. So this is an area, this is a map showing what world agriculture will be about 30 years from now if present trends continue and its impact on agriculture. And the areas shown here in red are areas where there's likely to be a 30% or more decline in agricultural yield. And that is due to the fact that it's going to become too hot and too dry for many crops like rice or maize. And you can see that huge areas of South America, North Africa, Southern Africa, India, China, Southeast Asia, they're going to face catastrophes for their agriculture because it's just going to be too hot and too dry to support the populations there. So it's going to be a catastrophe in those areas. And then if one looks at Boston right here, so this is a map showing downtown Boston or Beacon Hill right here. This is Boston University right here. And this is a map showing what Boston will look like if it gets hit by a hurricane at high tide about 30 to 40 years from now when the sea levels are predicted to be about 3 to 6 feet higher than they are now. And you can see that if a big hurricane hits Boston at high tide, that the entire city will be flooded. So all these areas of the Back Bay, South Boston, East Boston, areas of Cambridge, Somerville, we're all going to be under 6 to 10 feet of water. There's going to be tens of billions of dollars worth of damage to these areas. If I had a little bit more time to prepare for this, I would have gotten a map of Swampscott, but it's going to be a similar picture there also. So a lot of Swampscott and the surrounding areas are going to be underwater because of climate change. So it's not just about temperature, it's about rising sea levels and massive coastal flooding. One specific example, and this is for the Reverend here, a picture of Walden Pond, your favorite place. So Walden Pond is just a physical example of the effects of climate change. So in Thoreau's time, Thoreau kept records of when Walden thawed in the spring, and people have continued these records. And in Thoreau's time, Walden Pond mostly thawed at the end of March or the beginning of April, and now Walden Pond typically thaws in the middle of March. So there's been about a 2 to 3 week earlier thawing of Walden Pond, which is well documented, which is another effect of climate change. But we're biologists, so Professor Hitchcock and I are biologists, and we're concerned with how climate change is affecting the plants and animals of this region. And so when we refer to all the plants and animals of a region, we often call it biodiversity. And so our mission beginning in 2003 was to see how climate change was affecting the plants and animals of this region. So the second question that we wanted to know, besides how biodiversity was affected, was why should we care about it? And as biologists, we know that we should care about biodiversity because if it's affected by climate change, that means we're going to be losing a lot of rare plants and animal species that are protected. That means that our wetlands are going to dry out and be harmed. We could have impacts on our forests. We could lose a lot of the forests and all the benefits that the forests provide. So there's a lot of benefits which biodiversity provides to us, which we should be concerned with. And then the third question is, what are we going to do about it? And myself as a biologist, I've always been concerned with the fact that we should take the knowledge that we learn as scientists and we should make it available to the public and to the government so they can be aware of it and use it to make it a better society. So right from the beginning, our goal was to not only do the best science possible, but to make that science available to the public and the government. So if we're looking for the biological effects of climate change, there's really kind of 3 key indicators. One is on the timing of events, which scientists call phenology. So if it gets warmer in the spring, for example, plants might flower earlier. The second indicator, the biological indicator, is the distribution of species. So it might be that if conditions get warmer, that species will be found further north or higher up on mountains than they were in the past. And then the third indicator is on the abundance of species. So some species will like it when it gets warmer, and some species will be losers, and they will in fact get more rare as the conditions get warm. And the key approach in this type of research is to find old records and to match old records with new records, or even better, to find old records that people have maintained up until the present time. And then to analyze these records to see if you can see any fingerprints of climate change. And so beginning in 2003, we started to look for old records and to try to match them with modern records. And myself in particular, one of my graduate students named Abe Miller Rushing, and I just wandered all over the metropolitan Boston area looking for old records in 2003 and 2004. We looked in libraries, universities, we talked to people, we wrote little notes for newsletters. We stood up at all the funny little scientific societies we have in the New England region and asked people if they knew about old records. And then someone told us that, what about Thoreau's old records? And we said, what old records are those? And they said, well, Thoreau kept very detailed records. And we managed to find an independent Thoreau scholar who photocopied all of Thoreau's old records of when plants were flowering and birds were migrating in the spring, all kinds of records that Thoreau kept of the timing events in the spring. And as soon as we saw these old records, we knew that this was the gold mine, that this was something that was fantastic. And it turned out that from 1851 to 1858, Thoreau kept extremely detailed records of spring phenomenon in Concord, Massachusetts. And this is what these old records look like. And Thoreau liked to invent words. He was really kind of a funny guy, and it just as a joke, he used to make up words. And one of the words that he made up is the word relometer. So a relometer is an imaginary instrument for measuring reality. And it turns out that his journals, for his phenology journals, his unpublished phenology journals from the 1850s represent a relometer for measuring climate change. And so here's one of his tables from 1857, from May of 1857. And these are dates when he first saw plants in flower in Concord. Sorry. Here we go. These are one of his records from May of 1857. And here he says, like, high blueberry. So one thing which you notice here is that he had very messy handwriting. Also, sometimes he uses scientific names like V. vacillans or Uva ursi, and sometimes he used common names. So very confusing, bad handwriting, mixture of different names, often antiquated names. But still, we know that this is when he first observed high bush blueberry in flower in Concord, Massachusetts during that year of 1857. And so what we began to do starting in 2004 was to go out to Concord, Massachusetts and make observations on the same plants that Thoreau observed, often even in the same places, including around Walden Pond, of plants like bird's foot violet or the lady slipper orchid. We also found that there was another amateur botanist named Alfred Hosmer, who from 1878 to 1902 also made observations on first flowerings of plants in Concord, Massachusetts. And this is the results of what we got from our analysis. So each one of these symbols here represents the average first flowering time of 32 common wildflower species that Thoreau, Hosmer, and we saw in every year. So the thing which you have to point out here is that each one of these dots here represents a year of field work. So there's a lot of work that went into the simple figure here. So it's a simple figure, but each one of those dots represents a whole spring and early summer's worth of field work, of going out almost every day into Concord looking for the first flowering time. So from the 1850s through to the present time, and this is when 32 common wildflower species are on average flowering in the spring. And you can see that in Thoreau's years, there was variation in terms of when plants flowered, so later years and earlier years, but on average, the plants were flowering around May 15th. In Hosmer's years, a lot of variation, but the plants were flowering around May 10th. And then if you look in our years, that the plants, a lot of variation, but the plants are flowering around May 5th. So even though if you go out into Concord today, it looks like a very pristine environment. It's, see the church and the commons, and it looks very natural. But in fact, it is showing the effects of climate change in that plants are now flowering about 10 days earlier than they did in Thoreau's time. I want to also mention that we've done many years of field work. So we've done about 17 years of field work now in Concord, and we've written many articles about this from different perspectives, different kinds of analysis. And every time we have written a scientific paper about it, we've also written a press release and sent it off to various journals. And it's always covered by the New York Times, by the Boston Globe, and often National Public Radio. And because it connects climate change to Thoreau and Walden Pond. And as a result of this, it's a very good way to tell the story of climate change. But we also are making the efforts to do this. So we not only is it a good story, but we are very actively trying to tell the story. So what is causing this earlier flowering? So another way to analyze this exact same data is, instead of looking at changes over time, we look at changes in relationship to mean spring temperature. So the average temperature in March, April, and May. So these are very cold springs. These are in degrees centigrade. So this is about 30 degrees, and this is about 40 degrees centigrade, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are very cold springs. What it's about these? Sorry, this is about 40 degrees, and this is about 50 degrees. So this is looking at the difference between very cold springs and very warm springs, and this is showing when plants flower on the average. So each one of these dots here represents a year. The dark blue dots are Thoreau's years, the orange dots are Hosmer's years, and our dots are red years. And you can see here that when it's a very cold spring, that the plants flower very late, and when it's a very warm spring, like in 2010 and 2012, the plants flower astonishingly early. We really highlighted 2010 and 2012 here, as these were really the warmest springs we've ever had on record during those particular months. And what this tells you is that when it's a warm spring, plants flower early, and when it's a cold spring, they flower late. And we're just having a lot more warm springs now than in Thoreau's time. So it's not land use change or precipitation or anything else which is causing the climate change. It's the warming temperature which is driving this change. Thoreau also observed leafing out times, and so we've matched Thoreau leafing out times with our own leafing out times. And it is very clear that the trees are leafing out now about much earlier than in Thoreau's time. But what's very interesting is that the trees have now advanced by about 14 days in comparison to Thoreau's time, whereas the wildflowers have only advanced about 10 days. So the trees are actually more sensitive to climate change than the wildflowers. And there's a danger that by their leafing out ever earlier, that they're going to shade out the wildflowers, which need a couple of weeks of full sun in the spring in order to really get the energy that they need to flower and fruit later in the year. What's also interesting is that we're always looking for other ways of telling the story of climate change. And one thing which is New England is especially rich in is also historical photographs. New England has huge photograph collections. And one time after giving our lecture, a woman came up to us and told us that she had a very specialized hobby. Her hobby was to collect stereoscopic pairs of photographs taken at historically important cemeteries on Memorial Day. That was her special hobby. And she said that in her whole huge collection of photographs, she had one pair of photographs that were really unusual, and she wanted to show it to us. And so this was a photograph taken on May 30th, 1868 at the Lowell Cemetery. And there's something really odd about this photograph. So here's a test for Professor Hitchcock. So Professor Hitchcock, why does this photograph look really strange? This photograph taken on May 30th, 1868.
So you don't know this, but this is actually one of the things I do in class, and we play the highlights game for those who remember Highlights magazine from when you were a kid, and I ask students to circle the differences between these two photos.
So what do you think is strange about the photograph taken on May 30th?
there's no leaves on the trees. I'll start
Okay,
with the
okay,
low-hanging fruit.
okay, good. I'm going to put a check mark next to your name, okay?
Awesome. Can I give more, or is that all you wanted at this
Let's
point?
do it. So this photograph taken on May 30th is 1868, has no leaves. And just for contrast, the photograph on the right is a photograph taken as close as possible to the same perspective taken on May 30th, 2005. And of course, as you expect, the trees are fully leafed out. So in the 1850s and 1860s, the weather was just much colder than it is today. And 1868 in particular was known as a year with no spring. So there were hard frosts going through March, April, May, and even into June. So either these trees never leafed out by May 30th, or they started to leaf out and the leaves were killed by a frost. And in Thoreau's time, people were concerned that if the temperatures just got a little bit colder, that agriculture was going to completely fail in New England, and people wouldn't be able to grow enough food to eat, and also they would freeze during the wintertime. Whereas today, we're concerned that if the temperature just gets a little bit warmer than now, that world agriculture will fail, and as a society, we'll face great threats to our very existence. So the next question is, what are the birds doing? And it turns out that New England has a great abundance of bird data, and this data allows us to answer two questions, which is, are birds responding to climate change? And is their response similar to plants? And what we found by looking at a great variety of different kinds of bird data, so this is, for example, showing people catching birds at the Manomet Bird Observatory in Plymouth, analyzing a wide range of bird data from the Boston area, particularly places like, for example, Mount Auburn Cemetery. What we find is that a lot of bird species are not responding to climate change, and of the ones that are responding, they're only responding by arriving a couple of days earlier now than they did in the past, or a couple of days earlier than in Thoreau's time in Concord. And the reason for this is that when the birds are in South America or the Caribbean, or they're in the southeastern United States, they don't know what the temperature is like in New England. So they're starting to migrate, and they're also not responding only in relationship to temperature. For example, if it's rainy, they don't fly. If they're flying into a headwind, they don't fly. So they're responding to a lot of cues besides temperature. And as a result, they're not responding as closely to warming temperatures in New England as the plants are and the trees. And this sets up the possibility of a lot. So if you look at the temperature in the spring, how birds, trees, and wildflowers are responding, you can see that they have very different characteristics of response. And you can imagine that these, for example, are all Thoreau's times right here. So that the birds are arriving a little bit after, the birds are arriving right at the time that the trees are leafing out and the wildflowers are flowering. And what's happening is that the trees are responding the most strongly to climate change. The wildflowers are responding also strongly, but not as strongly as the trees. But the birds aren't responding very much at all, only a little bit. And this sets up the possibility of a mismatch, that if the birds are timed to arrive, just when the trees are leafing out and the flowers are coming out, and arriving just in time to catch the first big pulse of insects emerging, and then suddenly they're arriving later than the trees and the wildflowers are active, they might miss that first big pulse of insects that they need to feed on themselves, to nourish themselves, but also to feed their nestlings. And so there's a concern now, a very active concern of ecologists, that climate change might be harming birds by creating mismatches between birds and plants. And it turns out the connecting link between the birds and the plants are insects, because when the birds arrive in the spring, they're feeding on insects, and the insects are feeding on the plants. And so the question is how are insects responding to climate change? And so myself and my students, for a long time, we really struggled to find any insect data out there. We just couldn't find anyone that had information on insects. And then in 2005, we met people like Professor Hitchcock and others from the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, who had huge amounts of butterfly data they were collecting since 1986. And so a group of us, again, including Professor Hitchcock and I, began to analyze this butterfly data. And we found that butterfly data shows that butterflies respond very strongly to climate change. when there's a very warm spring, the butterflies come out early, and when it's a late spring, they come out later, and they're also changing over time. Since we published our results, there are also a lot of studies coming out of bees and other insect groups from New England, again showing that many insect groups are responding to climate change. So it's really birds that are not responding to climate change, and other groups are. When we've been doing our studies, we've also been finding that there are also a lot of other changes which are occurring to the plants and animals of this region besides simply changes in phenology. And as we began doing our studies of phenology, we kept running into the fact that we couldn't find many species that Thoreau and Hosmer had observed in Concord. So this became an important secondary focus of our research. We began to very actively look for plants such as the purple fringed orchid that used to be common in Concord and we had trouble finding. So we began this very intensive search for missing species or rare species. We eventually concluded that about 27% of the wildflowers that Thoreau, Hosmer, and other botanists had seen in the past in Concord were no longer present. And a lot of the species that used to be common are now rare. So again, with the purple fringed orchid, that this species used to be very common in river meadows, and we only found about 50 plants in one population in Concord. So it's a species which used to be common, which is now rare. In Thoreau's time, there were 21 orchid species known from Concord, 21 wild orchid species from Concord, and we were only able to find 7 of them. So particular groups like orchids and lilies have declined even more precipitously in Concord. There's a lot of reasons why this loss has occurred. So for example, air pollution, water pollution, habitat destruction, fragmentation, invasive species, deer. But we know that a lot of this loss is due to climate change. And we know this because the species which have been lost are disproportionately the cold-loving northern species, and the species that have stable populations are the warm-loving southern species. When we published these results, people were very skeptical of it. We got a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism, but this has now been replicated in many areas of New England now. New England is particularly rich in these kinds of historical studies, and the results are very consistent that you can clearly see the effects of climate change in the loss of wildflower species. And also birds and butterflies are showing these same patterns. So in the New England region, we have this historical records which show many southern species of both birds and butterflies are extending their range northward into New England in ways that we hadn't seen before. So we can see the effects of climate change on both the distribution and the abundance of species. So starting around 3 years ago, we've also realized that we had this very narrow laser-like focus on the spring, and that climate change was really affecting other seasons as well. So for example, you could imagine that very high temperatures and drought in the summer would cause very vulnerable wetland species to die out, that the lack of snow cover in the winter will cause hard freezes in the soil, affecting species which are hibernating in the soil to be harmed. But we decided to really focus on the autumn. And the autumn is a time when there's also large changes caused by climate change. So because of the fact that the weather is warmer in the spring and the first frost is later, that the trees are being held longer on the trees and on the shrubs, and that the birds are staying longer in the spring before migrating south. And also the butterflies and other insects are again active longer in the autumn before the first frost winds up killing them. So we're seeing a lot of effects on other seasons besides just the spring. And this is a very active area of research. One area that interests us particular is the interaction between the fruits that birds eat as they stay longer in the autumn. And a lot of our native shrubs keep maturing their fruits like blueberries at the same time, but the birds are staying longer. So the question is what they eat. And what we think a lot of the migratory birds are doing as they stay longer in the autumn is that they're eating the fruits of invasive species like barberries and multiflora rose. And this allows them to stay longer, but it's also one of the reasons why these invasive species are able to be so aggressive and to be very active in terms of invading new areas. So what does the future hold for us? So if we look at the future climate, so there were these predictions made as to what the future climate would look like. And what scientists had hoped a few years ago was that we would eventually stabilize at about a 2 degree centigrade or about a 4 degree Fahrenheit warming of temperature by the end of the century. But because the United States had pulled out of the Paris climate change accords with President Trump, and because many developing countries like China and India were continuing to develop very rapidly, it seemed like we were on where it seems like we are closer on track to this 3 degree centigrade or about a 6 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature by the end of the century, a much more frightening scenario. Well, what does that mean for the climate of Massachusetts? So when I was growing up in the kind of 50s and 60s, Massachusetts had a climate like Massachusetts. But Massachusetts now has a climate actually like New York City. And by the end of this century, Massachusetts is predicted to have a climate like North Carolina. And I lived for 4 years in North Carolina, and it was a very hot and humid place. And I remember going to sleep at night, just kind of sweating and just avoiding going out during the middle of the day. And that's really what Massachusetts' future is like. Well, in North Carolina, the most famous plant in North Carolina is the Venus Flytrap. It's the only place in the world where the Venus Flytrap lives. It lives on the coastal plain of North Carolina, right about here. And by the end of the century, North Carolina is going to be too hot and too dry for it. So here's another question for your professor. So Professor Hitchcock, so where in the United States do you think will be very good for the Venus Flytrap by the end of the century?
So I'm gonna say that the Venus flytrap should keep going south.
Keep going south where it's hotter?
Oh, I'm sorry. Keep. No, apparently it's too late
Okay.
for me.
Okay, you failed. So I'll tell people what the answer is. Okay, no, just joking. So where's it likely to be in the future?
We're gonna go north.
Okay, where north?
How far north?
Where exactly north? Where's it going to be the best place for the Venus flytrap in the United States?
Come to Massachusetts if Massachusetts
Right.
is becoming
So
North
based on this climate change scenario, the best place in the United States for the Venus flytrap is likely to be Massachusetts, and particularly the coastal plain of Massachusetts, primarily Plymouth County or the Outer Cape. So those kind of sandy meadows of Cape Cod are probably going to be the best place for the Venus flytrap in the future. Now, the Venus flytrap is a very small, nondescript plant, and it really has no ability to travel these hundreds of miles north to Massachusetts in just a few decades. So the only way that the Venus flytrap is going to not escape extinction and is going to travel north to Massachusetts in the next 50 years is going to be if biologists experimentally bring it north to these types of areas, introduce its seeds or adult plants, and to help it establish in this new location. This is something which is called assisted migration, and it's something that scientists are very actively considering right now. And I think it's something that we should be experimenting with right now as a possibility to prevent the extinction of these rare and endangered species. Okay, so where do we go with this data? How do we sort of use this data and try to make the world a better place? So what I think that scientists, that community leaders, people interested in conservation, members of conservation commissions, members of conservation organizations have a responsibility to try to reach out to the public, to reach out to the government, to reach out to children, and tell the story of climate change. And so for me, I'm always trying to connect climate change to Thoreau and Walden Pond, and I'm quite willing to talk to audiences. So here is me talking to French television. I'm waving my arms around very dramatically because I imagine that French people are very emotional. So this is a way to connect with French people. Here I am talking to a second grade class in Lincoln, Massachusetts, just on the border with Concord. As you notice here, I'm using the same slides that I use with you. I didn't give them exactly the same lecture, but some of the same slides. And I think it's important to try to teach children about climate change and about the reality of it and the need to do something about it. It's something that all of you can do also. So if you all start keeping a journal and record what you find interesting about climate change, you will see climate change over the next few years. And that particularly, I thought I noticed a lot of high school students among the audience. So high school students, if you just start keeping journals in Swampscott or wherever you wind up living, you will see the effects of climate change in terms of both gradual changes and extreme climatic events. So especially in a place like Swampscott, if you start recording the flooding which occurs in Concord and the ocean coming over the seawalls or flooding up creeks, you will see climate change over the next few years and certainly within the next 10 or 15 years. You will see climate change if you photograph it or if you record it in your journals. You can also contribute to climate change research by participating in citizen science networks, so things like iNaturalist or Nature's Notebook or eBird if you're interested in birds. And from what Professor Hitchcock mentioned to you, it sounds like these are already very active initiatives going on in Swampscott. And if you participate in them, whether individually or collectively, you will see the effects of climate change. And one example of, that it's kind of a dramatic example is that just if you start looking at extreme events, you even see right away the effects of climate change. So in 2002, in 16 and 2020, we had extreme climate events in New England, which are predicted to become more common in New England, somewhat more common in New England, and dramatically more common in places in the Western United States. So for example, when we had these extreme weather events that non-irrigated field crops like this corn crop just died in the field through lack of irrigation. We had woodpeckers, just coming desperately to hummingbird feeders for the water, and a lot of birds just prematurely migrating south. We had almost a complete disappearance of butterflies and insects from our fields and forests. And this is a photograph taken in August. So in August, the trees began to prematurely have their leaves turn color and drop in August. And this is an effect of climate change, that you can see these kinds of extreme weather events, which happened in the past, but are becoming more common right now. And then in particular, I just want to emphasize that people who are gardeners, birders, or hikers have a special role in this because you're outside a lot, or I should say in places like Swampscott. So people who are fishermen or fisher people can have sort of a special role to play in terms of being out there in the water and seeing things. And also people who are have a lot of decades ahead of them. So people who are high school students, you will see these effects over the course of your lifetime. And then sort of really close by just again emphasizing Thoreau and the book Walden. Again, this is a nod to our Reverend here, who is such a fan of Walden, that there's a lot of ways of reading the book Walden and thinking about Thoreau. And one of the things that I take out of reading the book Walden is the need to recognize reality and to use Thoreau's observations and Thoreau's writings as a relometer. And if you really look at all the evidence, it's really so dramatic that climate change is here, and that we really need to do something about it. And if we read Walden, we can really I actually read Walden in my climate change biology class. So we read Walden as a climate change book. And there's 3 lessons that we see throughout the book of Walden. One is to observe nature carefully. And if you observe nature carefully in terms of all the biology and all of the climate, all the phenomenon, like when ponds freeze, you will see the reality of climate change. You don't have to read about it or study a book about it. You will see climate change in front of you. The other message is to live simply. So Thoreau advised us to live simply because he said, if you will live simply, we'll be healthier, happier, and we won't have to work as hard. So we will be able to do other important things like learn about science, learn about philosophy and ethics. But if we live simply, this is really the way of addressing the problem of climate change. So the secret to solving the problem of climate change is for all of us to use less fossil fuel, to live in smaller houses, to use less electricity, less fossil fuels, to use public transportation, to use smaller cars, to eat less meat, eating a simpler diet, and also to do all these things. And this is really the way in which we can reduce our carbon footprint, both individuals and as a society. And the third thing that I take out of Walden is the need to address the injustices in society. And in Thoreau's time, the great injustices that he faced and society faced were the issues of war and slavery. And so Thoreau took very strong personal stands against war and against slavery. He spoke about it, he wrote about it, and he acted on his beliefs in a very public way. And right now, we similarly face these issues today. So these issues are still in front of us. We still face war around the world. We face violence. We face slavery still in the world today, and also persistent racism. So these issues are still with us, but we also face this issue of climate change, which is an existential threat to our society, both in general and also the most vulnerable members of the society are most affected by climate change. So if Thoreau is alive today, I think he would be a very strong advocate for the need to take action against climate change. He would speak about it, he would write about it, and he would speak about to our society. And so for all of us, we need to take individual action about climate change in terms of our own lifestyle, but we need to join political parties and to pressure our government to change what we're doing at a national level, and also to make agreements with other countries, and in particular with China. And we have a cause for hope right now that with this new administration coming in and the United States rejoining the climate change treaty, there's really hope for us to potentially deal with this problem of climate change. And for me, one of the ways in which I did it was, rather than talking to journalists all the time, was to try to put all the things that I was saying into this book, Walden Warming, to try to, again, reach the widest audience possible. So, and with that, I end, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Richard. If everybody can join me in a virtual clap. I've not seen a good way to do the virtual clap on Zoom yet, so if somebody else has perfected that, please let me know. We have had some questions come in as you were chatting, and so maybe we can start.
So Colleen?
Yeah.
Could I make a special request?
Of course.
So I noticed there's a lot of what seem to be high school students or college students in the group. Could we have the high school students ask questions first?
Sure.
Can we open that if they want to? If they want to. So if there are high school students there in the audience and you want to ask questions, can you please ask your questions first? And maybe how would they raise their hand, or they?
Yeah. So that was the next thing I was going to do. If you raise your hand virtually.
So if you're a high school student and you want to ask a question, you would please ask your question first.
So using the Zoom function to raise your hand, it'll bring you to the top of the list, and then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Or if you want to drop it in the chat, either way will work.
But no pressure here.
I think you put a lot of pressure on them. The bigger question is, did the second graders do better with the North Carolina, Massachusetts question than I did? I will admit I got caught off guard and was fussing with a dog issue in my house when you called on me. I did feel like a kid being called out in class for sure.
Okay, so no high school students are raising their hands?
No high school students are raising their hands yet, but I can start with a question that occurred in the chat when you were showing the cemetery
photo. What do we just say, that anybody can ask their questions now then? Yeah, okay.
Most definitely.
They had their chance. Go ahead.
So while you were showing the images of the two cemetery images, somebody put in the chat, but they're different trees. Could you maybe clarify or elaborate on kind of that idea?
Oh, I could actually give a whole lecture about those particular photographs. So here's an amazing story here. So you're right. So the trees you're seeing in the photograph, the trees that are leafed out, are actually more trees in the foreground, and those are actually, most of them are different trees. But here's an incredible story. So when I went to the cemetery for the first time in 2005, what I realized after I was there for a while is that you can actually see the outline of the trees in the photograph, in the 1868 photograph. And then when you walk around the cemetery, you can actually find those individual trees because some of them have unusual growth forms. So it turns out that more than half of the trees shown in that 1868 photograph are still there. And they are also leafing out early. So a lot of the trees actually are the same. And another interesting story is that when Abe Miller Rushing and I published the story of the photographs from the cemetery, there was a group of climate change deniers in the Boston area that organized themselves to disprove the photograph. So they actually got in they saw all the different aspects of the story, and they formed like a working group to try to check everything, like who took the photograph and whether the cemetery was there and whether Memorial Day was celebrated on May 30th of that year and what the weather was like that year. And so Abe and I were really worried, for about a week or so, but every part of the story checked out.
Awesome. That's great. And I forgot to stop recording. So I am going to stop recording now to, again, open it up for questions. And